January 1944, the Eastern Front just before dawn. Snow lies heavy over shattered farmland, turning craters into pale bowls of ice. The air is sharp, metallic, and still. German infantry crouch in frozen trenches, boots numb, fingers stiff around rifle stocks. Somewhere far behind the lines, a lone artillery piece fires once, then goes quiet. Silence returns. This is the rhythm they know. Fire, pause, wait. Then from the west a sound begins. At first it is distant, almost indistinguishable from thunder. A low rolling pressure that seems to travel through the frozen ground before it reaches the ears. It does not stop. It does not slow. It grows. This moment matters because by 1944 German soldiers had fought for years across Europe and the Soviet Union. They were veterans of blitzkrieg and attrition, hardened by Poland, France, Russia, and Italy. They believed they understood modern warfare. Artillery to them was powerful but limited. Guns needed rest. Barrels overheated. Ammunition ran out. Fire came in bursts, followed by silence. That silence was survival. What they were about to experience would challenge that belief completely. When American forces entered large-scale ground combat in Europe, they brought with them a doctrine unlike anything German soldiers had encountered. It was not built on daring maneuver or elite formations alone. It was built on logistics, on coordination, on the ability to deliver overwhelming firepower continuously, methodically, and without pause. At the center of this doctrine was artillery. The United States Army had spent years studying the lessons of World War I. It concluded that artillery was not merely a support weapon, but the decisive arm of modern land warfare. American planners reorganized their divisions accordingly. By 1944, U.S. infantry divisions were backed by more artillery pieces than their German counterparts and, crucially, by an ammunition supply system designed to never stop. German soldiers expected artillery to prepare an attack, then lift. They expected patterns. They expected lulls. Instead, they encountered something relentless. American artillery fire did not announce itself with a brief barrage. It settled in. It rolled forward, backward, then forward again. It adjusted with mathematical precision. Observers called corrections. Radios crackled. And the guns answered instantly. The sound became constant. German veterans later described it as a wall of noise, not individual explosions, but a continuous tearing of the earth. One soldier recalled that it felt as though the sky itself was being fed into the ground. Another described the sensation of waiting for silence that never came. This was not accidental. American artillery units were trained to fire by the clock. Fire missions overlapped. When one battery paused to cool barrels, another took over. Ammunition trucks moved day and night, though crews rotated without halting the barrage. Historical records confirm the scale. During major operations in 1944, U.S. divisions could fire tens of thousands of artillery rounds in a single day. In the Normandy campaign alone, American artillery fired more shells than Germany could produce in the same period. German intelligence noticed. Reports captured after the war speak of unimaginable ammunition expenditure. One German officer wrote that American artillery fire appeared inexhaustible. This was not exaggeration. It was observation. The emotional contrast for German soldiers was profound. They had been taught that the enemy would tire, that logistics would falter, that industrial strain would slow the tempo of battle. Instead, the fire continued. On the ground, this changed everything. Trenches that had protected soldiers for years became traps. Movement by day was impossible. Movement by night was hazardous. Rest became rare. Sleep became fragmented, shallow, haunted by the sound. The sound itself became the symbol, a deep, rolling concussion, repeating, unending. It followed units as they retreated. It greeted them when they tried to regroup. It returned whenever they attempted to dig in. American artillery was not only heavy, it was accurate. Forward observers, often positioned dangerously close to the front, directed fire with precision. Combined with air reconnaissance, American guns could respond within minutes, sometimes seconds. German counterattacks dissolved before they began. By late 1944, German soldiers began to speak of American artillery as a living thing, something that watched, waited, and responded instantly. This was not myth-making. It was psychological survival, an attempt to explain a force that seemed beyond human limitation. Documents from the Ardennes campaign show this clearly. During the Battle of the Bulge, German forces hoped to exploit bad weather to neutralize Allied air power. They succeeded briefly. What they did not neutralize was artillery. American guns fired through fog, snow, and darkness. Fire missions were pre-registered. Maps were prepared in advance. When German armor advanced, artillery fire descended with devastating effect. One German report from December 1944 noted that American artillery fire is immediate and overwhelming. Another admitted even successful penetration stalled under continuous shelling. The transformation was ideological. German doctrine had emphasized maneuver and decisive blows. American doctrine emphasized endurance and coordination. Where German artillery relied on limited stockpiles and centralized control, American artillery relied on abundance and decentralization. Every unit could call for fire. Every request was answered. The sound did not belong to a single gun. It belonged to a system. That system reflected something larger. American democracy, often criticized by its enemies as inefficient and divided, had mobilized its industry with extraordinary speed. Factories produced shells by the millions. Railroads moved them across continents. Trucks delivered them to muddy fields in France, Belgium, and Germany. German soldiers understood this on a visceral level. They did not see factories. They heard the result. The sound never paused. By early 1945, German morale had eroded not only from defeat, but from exhaustion. Veterans spoke of the inability to think under constant bombardment, of the sense that resistance was futile when the enemy could fire indefinitely. Captured diaries reveal despair not tied to individual battles, but to the nature of the fighting itself. One entry notes that American fire has no end. Another states simply that they have more shells than we have men. These were not metaphors, they were conclusions. As American forces crossed the Rhine, artillery preceded them everywhere. Towns were reduced before infantry arrived. Roads were cratered to deny movement. German units surrendered often without seeing the enemy face to face. The sound had done its work. In the final weeks of the war, even as Germany collapsed, American artillery continued to fire with discipline. There was no frenzy, no desperation. Just procedure. Missions called, rounds fired, guns cleaned, ammunition replenished. The symbolism was complete. The recurring sound of artillery fire represented more than destruction. It represented a society capable of sustained effort, a system that did not rely on moments of brilliance, but on consistency, on abundance, on organization. In the epilogue of this story, one returns to that frozen trench, to the German soldier listening for silence, to the belief that if the barrage stopped, survival might follow. It did not stop, and in that unbroken sound, the sound followed them east. As American armies advanced deeper into Germany in early 1945, the terrain changed, but the experience did not. Forests replaced hedgerows. Rivers replaced fields, towns grew tighter, streets narrower, yet the artillery adapted without hesitation. Fire plans were redrawn, coordinates recalculated, guns repositioned with mechanical efficiency. German soldiers had believed that the homeland would feel different. That familiar soil might offer psychological shelter. Instead, the bombardment intensified. By this stage of the war, American artillery doctrine had matured into something almost surgical. Counter-battery fire neutralized German guns within minutes of detection. Sound-ranging equipment and flash-spotting teams located enemy positions even at night. When German artillery attempted to respond, American fire drowned it out. German after-action reports from the Rhine crossing describe an environment where movement was nearly impossible. Units attempting to regroup were shattered before formation. Roads clogged with refugees and retreating soldiers became killing zones. The American guns did not chase targets emotionally, they erased them methodically. The expectation among German officers had been that American soldiers relied heavily on air power. That poor weather or nightfall would create opportunity. What they learned instead was that artillery never slept. American gunners worked in rotating shifts. While one crew rested, another loaded. While one battery cooled, another fired. Ammunition stockpiles were layered, protected, redundant. Even damaged supply routes were repaired within hours. This relentless continuity created a psychological collapse that traditional defeat could not. German soldiers did not simply lose battles. They lost faith in the idea that resistance mattered. Captured German officers later admitted that American artillery broke units before contact. Men arrived at defensive lines already shaken, exhausted, and resigned. Their bodies survived, their will did not. One recurring observation appears again and again in German testimony. The Americans did not appear hurried. That detail mattered. The fire did not feel desperate. It did not surge and fade like earlier wars. It maintained pressure. It suggested confidence. The sound itself became a form of communication. It conveyed the message that boom time after boom, the enemy. Hour after hour, it told German soldiers that American industry stood behind every shell. That factories were still producing, that ships were still unloading, that trains were still running. That democracy, however messy in theory, had become terrifyingly efficient in practice. By contrast, German artillery units faced shortages that worsened by the week. Ammunition rationing became common. Guns sat silent not because they chose to, but because they had nothing left to fire. Crews waited, listening to American shells explode, knowing they could not answer. The emotional contrast sharpened into bitterness. German propaganda had promised technological superiority, discipline, and resolve. What soldiers experienced instead was inferiority in scale. Not bravery versus cowardice, but scarcity versus abundance. American artillery officers understood this psychological dimension. Fire was not random. It was layered. Harassment fire denied sleep. Concentration fire shattered attacks. Defensive barrages anticipated movement before it occurred. Even when no attack was planned, the guns fired. The sound remained. In urban combat, the effect multiplied. Towns like Cologne, Aachen, and later smaller villages became echo chambers of destruction. Stone buildings collapsed inward, cellars filled with dust and smoke. German soldiers hiding below ground experienced the bombardment as suffocation rather than impact. Every explosion displaced air. Every concussion pressed into lungs. The body absorbed the war. Medical reports from German field hospitals describe soldiers arriving without visible wounds, yet unable to speak, shaking uncontrollably, deafened temporarily or permanently. Shell shock, renamed but unchanged, spread rapidly. American units, observing this, adjusted tactics further. Artillery was used not only to destroy positions but to isolate them psychologically. Continuous fire severed communication. Messengers could not run. Radios failed. As April 1945 approached, the scale became almost incomprehensible. American artillery units fired in support of multiple advancing columns simultaneously. Coordination reached a level unseen earlier in the war. Maps were annotated with layers of fire zones, fallback lines, emergency concentrations. German attempts to establish defensive belts collapsed within hours. The symbolism of the artillery sound had fully replaced earlier symbols of power. Tanks, once feared, now followed behind fire. Infantry advanced into silence not because resistance was absent, but because it had already been crushed. In some sectors, German soldiers surrendered en masse before American troops arrived. They raised white flags at the sound alone. This surrender without contact baffled some American commanders at first. Reconnaissance would report enemy positions intact, yet unoccupied. Weapons abandoned. Trenches empty. The enemy had simply left. The sound had told them there was no future there. One American artillery officer later reflected that the gun crews rarely saw the enemy, yet knew their effect intimately. They measured success not in territory taken, but in silence achieved. When German guns stopped answering, when movement ceased, when observers reported no return fire. That silence earned through relentless sound became the marker of victory. As the war neared its end, the American artillery machine did not slow. There was no sense of conserving ammunition. Stockpiles remained vast. The priority was speed, not restraint. German civilians, now fully exposed to the front, experienced the same lesson soldiers had learned earlier. The sound did not discriminate between battlefield and homeland. It rolled through towns, fields, and forests alike. Yet even in this destruction, there was consistency. American artillery did not lash out blindly. Targets were selected, fire plans approved, the violence followed procedure. This distinction mattered deeply in post-war reflection. German survivors later contrasted American artillery with earlier experiences on the Eastern Front. Where Soviet fire felt chaotic and overwhelming, American fire felt structured, intentional, and inexhaustible. Both destroyed, but one communicated system. That system represented something beyond the battlefield. The recurring sound, steady, unbroken, methodical, became the audible signature of American democracy at war, not emotional, not impulsive, but committed, organized, supplied. By May 1945, as Germany surrendered, the guns finally fell silent. For the first time in months, German soldiers heard wind without thunder, birds without interruption. Silence returned not as relief, but as disbelief. The absence of sound felt unnatural. They spoke of courage, of duty, of sacrifice, but returned again and again to artillery, to the sense that the enemy could fire forever. They had not lost faith in themselves alone. They had lost faith in the possibility of endurance against such abundance. The war had taught them a lesson harsher than defeat. That ideology without resources collapses under pressure. That discipline without supply becomes desperation. That belief cannot replace production. The artillery sound had been the teacher. In the epilogue of this extended story, one must return to the meaning behind the noise. Not simply destruction, but demonstration. The demonstration that a society capable of organizing its economy, its people, and its ideals could apply pressure indefinitely. The guns did not shout. They spoke steadily, and in that steady voice lay a truth that echoed far beyond 1945, that freedom, when sustained by unity and abundance, does not need to pause.